Okay, continuing with what we were talking about with Noah and his curse on the Canaanites. And we were trying to establish whether or not this curse that Noah is supposed to have issued against Canaan provided any justification for transatlantic slavery or the domination of the Jews over the Palestinian peoples today. So continue with your answer.
So therefore, I am saying that if people want to take the curse in the Bible, whatever it was, and use it as a means to legalize slavery, something would have to be wrong with the character of God. Because as I said previously, no human being has the right to enslave another. We all are born equal, which many people do not seem to understand. And we all should be treated with respect and dignity. So therefore, for a person, right, it is like in apartheid where people are arguing that God would want the blacks and the whites to be separate, and you use draconian measures to maintain this separation of races. So there's something is absolutely wrong. So I cannot find any ways. I thought about it all over, up, down. I tried to scrape my mind, and I cannot find anybody who claim that they are Christian, who has an understanding of humanity and life, that would want to use the Bible, a book that is a holy book, that is supposed to set the captives free and heal those that are bruised, to use a passage or a passage in the Bible to argue and to perpetrate the enslavement of another race. It can't be.
Yeah, but you know, this is precisely the problem, because people do refer to this particular incident and use it as justification for the subjugation of descendants of Ham. That they don't only limit it, however, to the descendants of Canaan. They say all of the descendants of Ham would be drawers of water and hewers of wood. So the Bible has been used by many people as the source to say that this is something that is supported. And of course, when you move out of the Old Testament, you go into the New Testament, then you have the passages like servants obey your masters in the Lord, and all the different counsels that we find, like what you just mentioned, Paul telling a runaway slave to return home. So many people do argue that the Bible does seem to be supportive of slavery. But at the same time, if we take slavery to be a moral evil, then if the Bible is supporting slavery, then wouldn't the Bible be supporting a moral evil?
If it was, if it was, slavery is evil. It is one of the most heinous crimes that has been perpetuated upon the human race.
So you're not allowing for any possibility that there could be good slavery and bad slavery. We're not going down that line at all. Slavery is slavery, and slavery is evil.
Slavery is slavery as long as there's no personal freedom, no religious freedom, no social freedom, none of those freedoms.
All right, I can go with you on that. Now, moving now off the issue of slavery, let's go to the issue of sexism, which is another problem we have today, causing quite a lot of disturbance. Now, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, we find that there seems to be a preference for the male gender. Take, for example, the Israelites were surrounded by many other peoples, and these people had a tradition of both male and female priests and priestesses. It's interesting to note that the Israelites avoided the inclusion of female priests in the services of the sanctuary. As a matter of fact, the priesthood in the Old Testament was exclusively male. Now, when we shift from the Old Testament, come over to the New Testament, we find that bias toward the male still continues to be quite evident. We hear Paul talking about the
I don't
man.
like the use of the word bias, but we'll speak about that. I don't like the use of the word bias.
Well, you will have a chance to answer the question as I put it, and you can answer as you choose to answer, as you well know. But you find Paul making the statement: husbands are the head of the wives. Wives submit to their husbands. Husbands are the head of the home. And we also find Jesus choosing all male cast of disciples. Now, in the light of contemporary developments where there's emphasis on individual rights, which would suggest that women have just as much rights as men. Do you think that the biblical injunction about male headship and the exclusion of women from certain professions, for example, the ministry, do you think these things are still relevant in today's setting with our emphasis on feminism and with our emphasis on human rights, equal rights for all human beings, irrespective of gender, race, religion, class, color, creed?
There is the spiritual and there is the natural. Now, specifically, God Himself gave that instruction. There has to be a reason that God gave the instruction. Now, that was not a problem till the French Revolution, you know. In the French Revolution, we must understand where we had the feminist movement and these things coming out. There was an attack on everything that God had set up. Now, my clear understanding is that man and woman are equal. Let me repeat. Male and female are equal. But from my understanding of the Bible, God has clearly set different roles for the different sexes. God did not, from the Bible, set a woman to be a priest or a pastor. It does not stop her from functioning in the church, but there is a specific role for the woman. Nobody is saying that the woman can't function, but understand, if we understand the French Revolution, it was an attack against God, the Bible, and all that God has set up. If you love the ruler, you obey the rules. And God Himself has set up the system that man, when it came to ecclesiastical matters, when it came to the priesthood, etc., that was the function for man. God is creator, God knows all, and there's a reason why God set that up. So when we have now people come in and they want to attack what God has set up, I rather obey God than man. As a matter of fact, I believe that from the time that women came into the priesthood, it was then very easy for homosexuality to come in. It's going to be easy for many other things to come in. You understand? Because when you, for example, now here's it, a man is supposed to be head of the house, but his wife is a pastor or priest. Now she has the ecclesiastical authority and power, but when she comes home, she is supposed to subject herself to her husband who does not have that role. There must be a problem. There must be a problem. Now, let me make it very clear. When the Bible says that women subject yourselves to your husband, etc., it does not mean that the man must still treat, brutalize, or what. Paul is very clear also, husband, love your wives. But the man is priest of the household. Man is head of the woman. Christ is head of the church. And God is head of Christ. That's how we see it. That's what the Bible says.
Okay. Now, in the Old Testament, there were a whole lot of prescriptions that were given to the Jews. Like, for example, if a man went out gathering sticks on the Sabbath day, that man could be executed. And there were a whole host of other capital offenses: blasphemy, cursing your parents, witchcraft. Now, you would agree with me that maybe it's a good thing that we do not follow these prescriptions today. Otherwise, a whole lot of people would have to be killed. But the reality is that these were prescriptions that were given in the Bible. But I don't think that even the most conservative or Christians push for the implementation of these prescriptions in the contemporary setting. Now, my question to you is, when the Bible talks about man being the head of the woman and women not being allowed to go into the priesthood, could we not see those as things that were tempered by the times in which they lived? But now that we are living in a completely different age, these things, just like how you have the prescription about killing people for Sabbath breaking, or killing people for adultery, or killing people for cursing their parents, just like how we don't follow those things again, even though there were things that were prescribed within the Bible. Don't you think that maybe the contemporary setting has a certain amount of leeway also in terms of dealing with the issue of the female subjugation to the male, and women not being allowed to enter into the priesthood and not being able to be co-heads with men? What are your thoughts?
I am one who always believes and realizes that God is particular. God is very particular. He's not, as we said, namby-pamby God. God was very specific on who the pastor or the bishop should be. God was specific that it is to be a male and it is to be a male. I see no indication or in the Bible that seems to imply that as time rolled on, that there must be a change.
But I could argue and say that he was also very specific about slaying people who broke the Sabbath, or slaying people who committed adultery or cursed the parents. He was also very specific. So why are we going to stick to one set of specific instructions and say, yes, God is very specific on these, but at the same time, kind of ignore some of the other very specific instructions that were given as well?
I believe that when Jesus spoke on certain things in relation to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, etc. Jesus never, from my memory in reading the Bible, indicated that there was to be a change in the order or the gender of the priesthood.
So you're saying that with the coming of Jesus, there was an evolution or a change in terms of some of these religious prescriptions?
I am saying that I believe in cases, remember, I believe, this is my belief, that in cases one had to have a change, because sometimes people would always use the law to their own advantage. But I'm saying that as we progress, the Bible says those that judgment is not executed upon the wicked speedily. So we find that as we progress and as laws and civil laws and things were set, and we got different systems, those things would go to the law courts.
Okay. All right, let's move in to another issue. Now, somewhere around 2009, a number of white evangelicals went into Africa to do some talks on the anti-gay movement. Now, soon after these white evangelicals left Uganda was the country they went to. Soon after these white evangelicals left Uganda after doing these workshops on the gay agenda, Uganda passed a very controversial anti-gay bill, which basically outlawed homosexuality, and it also basically, we had a just short break in transmission there, but the law also prescribed a 14-year imprisonment term for anyone guilty of homosexuality. Now, that was the revised law. The original law that was introduced, and a guy by the name of David Bahati, who was a Ugandan MP, he proposed the death penalty for repeat offenders in the area of homosexuality. Now, it seems to me that historically, Christians have helped to create a climate their hatred against homosexuals and homosexuality has actually been engendered. Now, do you think that Christians ought, by terms of how they address the issue of homosexuality, create an environment that makes it hostile for homosexuals and also may result in violence against homosexuals? Do you think Christians should be helping to create that kind of hostile environment for LGBTQ communities?
I am appalled at some Christians and their attitude toward the LGBTQ, etc. Now, sin is sin. Unfortunately, I've discovered up to last week that for some reason, homosexuality is separated and put as the greatest sin. And Christians, based on the attitude, and I have witnessed it, and you yourself have witnessed it, is that some Christians believe that the homosexual has no right to life. He should be stoned. He should be incarcerated. He should be shot. All of these things. We've seen Christians march, and the things that they had written up on papers was appalling. They themselves have driven people who may have been on the borders, who are homosexuals or are homosexuals, and who would love to come to church. They themselves sometimes, because of their actions, have stopped some of these people coming to church who will hear the gospel of Jesus Christ and would hear what they need to hear to change their lifestyles. Christians must carry a lot of blame for what is going on as far as hatred, bigotry, and all these things against homosexuals. Let me make this position clear, right? If you continue to lie, you'll go to hell. If you continue to backbite, you will go to hell. If you begin to slander, you will go to hell. So therefore, once sin is sin, so therefore homosexuality is no greater sin than all of the rest, and the attitude must change. I am going to repeat. A homosexual has the right to life, has the right to work, has the right to do all things. They have made that choice. We have to demonstrate to them love, care, and compassion. We are not supporting what they're doing, but it's only by love that some of them may be able to understand and to change. But if we continue to be hostile, we will drive them further into the camp of Satan. Christians should be shamed for some of the actions. You know what Paul said? Paul was speaking to the church at, I think, Corinth, and he spoke about homosexuality, and he said, look, some of you were so, you know, some of you were so. So therefore, we see that like anybody that's a homosexual can be transformed, can be convicted, converted, and transformed. And that should be the aim of the Christian, not to drive them away and impose a death penalty and ostracize them, these things. And
Okay.
call that
in Christian circles today, there's the idea or the name about what would Jesus do. Now, how do you think Jesus would relate to the issue of the LGBTQ community? We know that in the days of Jesus, the most hated people were the tax collectors and, of course, the class of people that the Jews referred to as sinners, which would have been people who were living a dissolute life, prostitutes and drunkards. And these were the people that Jesus seemed to have fraternized with quite freely. So much so that people began to say that he keeps company with wine bibbers and with prostitutes and tax collectors. How do you think Jesus would relate to the LGBTQ community if he were alive in our times?
Jesus came to save the lost. And Jesus would do all he could for those folks. Jesus, by his unique way of teaching, by his love, would reach out to them. And Jesus, in my opinion, right, would demonstrate the love of God, would point them to the Father, would show them, look, this is not the lifestyle that you were created for. And Jesus would do all he could to bring them to an understanding that in the eyes of God, homosexuality is wrong. But I don't think that he would threaten them with the point of the sword. I think he would do it through love, care and compassion.
Okay, as we come to the end of this interview, we want to look at the big issue. We want to go back to the big issue of George Floyd and the marches that are going on in the US and around the world. Now, of course, you know that these marches come as a result of two main issues. One, racial discrimination against people of African ancestry, something that is happening in the US, something that is happening in Brazil. Wherever Black people are, there are these problems of discrimination. I was reading just recently, and a Black woman in Brazil said something that I found rather interesting and intriguing. She said that there are certain buildings in Brazil that the darker you are, the more difficult it is to get in. These buildings have electronic doors. And the darker you are, the more difficult it is for you to get through these electronic doors. Now, of course, getting into a building because of some kind of racist technology that prevents Black people from getting into a building is one thing. But when you have now a police force which is deliberately targeting the Black community with some of the most vicious violence, now that is another issue altogether. So we have the issue of racial discrimination, plus we also have the issue of police brutality. That's what the George Floyd marches are all about. Now, my question is, how should the church be relating itself to these two issues, the issues of racial discrimination against Black people, and number two, the issue of police brutality, as it relates to Black people and indeed as it relates to all people, because police brutality is something that seems to have a global occurrence. How should the church relate to these two issues?
The church must speak out against racial discrimination. God created all of us. As a matter of fact, it is amazing some things that I'm reading. It's amazing some things that I'm reading, because when I read and I'm listening to the experts, etc., it tells me that the majority of the people in the Old Testament were Black. There is strong arguments to state that Jesus was Black, although color will not save us. So therefore, the church must open its mouth and must be more aggressive and more prominent in declaring that racial discrimination is wrong. The church must not only preach from the pulpit. The church is respected and has authority within the society. The church must begin to rate. It must begin to demonstrate peacefully. It must begin to go to all those persons who have influence and power and use its influence, the church's influence, in the set to bring a change. Because if the church is representing the character of Christ, God does not see white, brown, Black, or yellow. God sees his creation, his humanity. And the church must include this whole thing of racial discrimination within its ranks. But unfortunately, some churches can't do that. They're not here in my base, because there's some churches who still practice racial discrimination. So how can you cry out against racial discrimination when you are a participant? No. The George Floyd issue is one where the church must be upfront. Again, the church cannot sit down and just talk and want to hide. The church should be upfront, and the church should be out there on the streets. The church should be calling upon the ministers of government. The church should be calling upon all the world organizations, United Nations, all of these, letting join in this whole cacophony of songs and protests that is taking place, because it has to stop. It has to stop. Don't come and tell me all the time that you're praying. Faith without works is dead. Yes, pray, but do some action too. And
Okay.
if the church fails to respond, fails to act, it also would fail in its mission.
Okay, so we are saying then that as we started out, Isaiah chapter 61, verse 1, it talks about preaching the gospel, but there's also a very practical element which then takes us, which could very well take us into the streets. And when we go back to the discussion we had previously with the group of Christians who were talking about social justice, you kind of got the impression from many of the individuals who were at the webinar that it is not the place of the church to be on the street marching with other people for social justice.
Probably mad.
Right. Do you think churches need to join with other organizations that are working for social justice, especially if they have a march? Should the churches join in these marches? Should the churches organize their own marches? What was the practical advice you would give to churches with respect to how they need to practically go about protesting against racial discrimination and indeed police brutality?
Let me say this. If there was going to be a national march tomorrow, the church should join in the national march. Now, if the church don't want to join in a national march for peace, for justice, these same people, right? If the church doesn't want to join and the church wants to have its own march, only Christians, will this same church want to turn around now and try to ask some of these people to come to their church? No. Once there is a good cause, the church must be involved and should be involved. It is not you're not marching politically. You're not marching to bring down a government. You're not marching to overthrow anybody. You are marching for equal rights and justice. And the church should join, to be one of the first to join. And I don't want a segregation in the march. It is for a good cause, and the church should be there among all of the rest. So if people believe that if the church can march and you got somebody may come and misbehave, but they live in a different world.
Mm-hmm. You know, because that's what I was going to say now, that as one person said in the webinar, it would look bad to see Christians marching and then violence break out and looting break out and Christians are involved in that kind of march. But it is very difficult to predict what people are going to do. As you would recall, I didn't make mention of the fact that Christians could be within their congregations and violence could break out right there, as has happened in a number of churches where people have actually gone into churches and started shooting Christians. So you cannot dictate what people will do, but at the same time, that does not give you an excuse not to participate in a process that is designed to bring healing, a process that is designed to bring reconciliation, and of course, a process that is designed to bring about change. Now,
I'm going to make a point quickly.
Yeah, make your point.
If I'm not wrong, I am sure that the churches in Barbados marched against domestic violence. I'm sure of that. I'm sure that when we look, let me go back to the great Martin Luther. Martin Luther may not have had a march, but Martin Luther did something that was unheard of. Martin Luther took his...
Clarify that. When you say Martin Luther, you're not talking about Martin Luther King. You're talking about Martin Luther.
No, Martin Luther, the great reformer, the German reformer.
Some people may think you're talking about Martin Luther King.
No, I'm talking about Martin Luther.
Did march.
One of the most prominent persons in the Reformation, right? He may not have marched, but Martin Luther spoke out against the injustices of the Catholic Church by nailing his 95 theses on Wittenberg Castle. You know, so we see these folks, because at the time he wouldn't have been allowed to have that sort of march, but he protested against injustice. And when you check the Bible, these things, Jesus spoke out against injustice. All the rest of the folks, can you remember that they told Peter and Paul, etc., don't sing and don't preach and all sorts of things? What did they do?
Well,
What did they do?
they practice civil disobedience. As a
Yes.
matter of fact, as we did mention in the webinar, that just to be a Christian was an act of civil disobedience in the first century, because Christians were claiming to be serving a different king other than Caesar, and that was seen as sedition. So just to be a Christian was a radical action for any Roman citizen to take, and it was an act of civil disobedience. Okay, I want to go to the last question that I have here, and you know, the Bible talks about the church being the salt of the earth, and it talks about the city set on a hill that is supposed to give light to everybody, to set an example. Do you see any evidence that churches today are, in fact, striving to be the salt of the earth, or that city that is set on a hill? Is the church having that kind of impact on the community? And if not, how do you see the future of the church with respect to engagement with the world?
But first of all, we know salt adds flavor. You know, salt adds flavor and it also cures things. The church must add flavor to a world that is bland and evil and wicked and corrupt, all of these things. So therefore, if the church does not add flavor by doing things that makes it different, showing that it cares, feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, going on the block and speaking to persons, mingling in the community, bringing comfort, all of these things, the church cannot be solved. So therefore, in this particular situation, where you have total injustice, and the church does not show its light, there will still be darkness. So therefore, the church, whenever you look at it in the questions that you are answering, it is really showing that the church must be active. It must participate. It must speak out against injustice. It must be totally involved in things that affect human beings, humankind. For the church just to keep quiet, it's not a church. It's just a group of people.
So in other words, if the church is not performing its role to be the salt of the earth, or it is not performing its role of being that city on a hill, then basically it is not living up to the mandate that was given to the church. And my last question then would be, if the church is not living up to its mandate, then what becomes of the church?
Well, what I would say this, one of the good things about it is that I believe that overall the corporate church may not do that, but I believe that within the churches there are people who have been moved by the Spirit of God, who clearly understand the mandate. So I still believe that within the church we'll find groups of people who will do what God requires, So although you may not have the whole corporate body doing what it is supposed to do, I still believe that God will always have groups of people in all churches, and I stress all churches, not one particular church, who will do what God expects them to do, because God moves upon the heart of men and women who will hear and who will adhere. That is why I believe the remnant are the Bible talks about a remnant. I believe that these people who really and truly are so filled with the Spirit of God that they will function and that they will show humanity that yet still there are people who care, who love, who are committed to the improvement of mankind.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Prince, for your illuminating thoughts on this very intriguing subject of the church and its involvement in social justice. And as we've said in this discussion, there are quite a number of problems facing our communities, And if the church is supposed to be the salt of the earth, if the church is supposed to be the city set on a hill that is supposed to be an example, then obviously the church needs to come out from its walls and actually intermingle with the community, get involved in things that are of importance to the community so that it can perform its role of being the salt of the earth. So we talked
I
about.
want to make one last comment. Huh?
Well, this
Can
is going
I?
to be the last comment because I'm wrapping up.
Yes. Okay. Now, I think one of the problems that we face in churches, people go to churches and the churches have their beliefs, etc. And the problem that we have is that a lot of churches now have so much control over the members that if they don't follow certain patterns or certain rules and regulations, they are withdrawn from being members of that church. To me, it's a form of intimidation, and people must have the determination. People must be brave enough, you know, that if they see things are going wrong and something needs to be done, do it. Right? Do it. You're not looking for your reward from God. You're looking for your reward from man. And as much as the church may want to put you out or disfellowship you or whatever, or excommunicate you, once you're functioning on the principles of God, you have nothing to fear. I close.
Thank you very much. So we have a number of social issues. We have racism, we have police brutality, we have the inequality of wealth, we have sexism, we have homophobia. All of these are social issues impacting our societies today. And the church is supposed to have the medicine to help societies deal with these very vexing problems. But of course, for the church to help the society deal with these problems, the church has to be where the society is. The church has to mingle with people in the society and somehow bring that salt. So it is our hope that as we go forward, we would be able to see more religious communities coming out of the four walls of the church and getting into the trenches, making a difference, making this world a better place. Once again, thank you very much, Mr. Prince, and we trust that this discussion would open the door to even more discussion and indeed more involvement of churches with their communities. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.